to be here and to participate at this conference. And before to start, I want deeply thanks all the organizers, the Institute of Network Society, and the School of Intermedia Art of China Academy. In my speech, I want to present and discuss what I define as the research program of Henri Lefebvre and its current possible developments. I will start with some necessary preliminary consideration. Lefebvre was an eclectic, tireless, and passionate thinker. He had an unusual academic career. He wrote more than 60 books and hundreds of articles. He founded several reviews. He crossed disciplines and conducted many theoretical and political struggles. All his life has been characterized by a deep political engagement, by an intense desire of changing social life. From the juvenile contact with the artists and literary avant-garde and the foundation of the group Les Philosophes with intellectuals like Pierre Morange, Norbert Guterman, and others, and to the entry in the French Communist Party in the 1928 and engagement in the anti-fascist struggle over the years 1941-1945, from the critique to the process of the Stalinization of the European Communist parties during the 50s, and the break with the French Communist Party in 1958, to his strong influence on the French social movement of 1968, the whole Lefebvre's biography is characterized by a continuous political positioning and repositioning. Coherently, his theoretical work was animated by the most pure philosophical passion, the marvel for the real. And by real, we don't mean metaphysical real, but social and historical reality. The activity of men and women, life that produced life, to quote Marx, was the mystery that Lefebvre tried to understand all his career. Lefebvre was surely an heterodox thinker. In a long autobiographical interview published with the title Les Temps de Mépris in 1975, he defines himself as a marginal and barbaric. Playing with his mountainous origins, he lived most of his life in Paris, but he was from mountain next to the Pyrenees. He elaborates a spatial metaphor for describing his own specific perspective point of observation and analysis of the social reality. In Lefebvre's spatial thought, in fact, the margin, the periphery, is considered a space of transformation, a place where the past vanishes and the new assemblies take shape. The margin, therefore, metaphorically indicates a way of observing and thinking. It is from the margin, for example, that Lefebvre describes the dynamic of explosion of the city in the emergence of urban society. To put it briefly, the margin is a sort of gaze displacement politically oriented. To further emphasize this point, Lefebvre provocatively defines himself as barbaric, as some alien to the codification of philosophical tradition of modernity. Starting from this kind of way of thinking, engaged, rhapsodic, and provocative, Lefebvre traced a very articulated intellectual itinerary, characterized by both elements of continuity and discontinuity, in which, between the late 50s and the mid-70s, takes form a rich research program. I use this expression, research program, with a precise epistemological meaning. I implicitly refer to the philosophy of science of Imre Lakatos, who was one of the most interesting science philosophers of the 20th century in Europe. For Lakatos, in fact, a research program is defined by a set of theories that share an hardcore theoretical assumption that can evolve and proliferate. A research program is not a coherent development of some hypothesis, but rather a multiplication of investigation direction starting from a declared strong theoretical core assumption. Then, to put it very simple, a research program is a sort of device of theory production. And its peculiarity is the openness, the possibility of articulation of different research directions. In my view, the epistemological model well describes the Lefebvrean philosophy of space, starting from the hardcore theoretical assumption of the social production of space. In fact, Lefebvre draws different lines of research, still liable of developments. The goal of my speech is to show the genesis of Lefebvre's research program, to discuss its articulation, and to identify some elements particularly relevant nowadays. In his main work, La production de l'espace, the production of space, published in France in 1974, Lefebvre declares the intent to transform, I quote, the critique of the political economy of things in space into the critique of the political economy of space. This latter, the critique of political economy of space, defines Lefebvrean research program by highlighting at the same time the fundamental reference to Marx's philosophy. In fact, even if influenced from different theoretical sources, Lefebvre's research program is formulated in the framework of the critique of political economy. For that reason, it is primarily important to show the particular relationship with Marx and Marxism. To summarize the issue with a joke, one can say that Lefebvre maintains a good relationship with Marx and a more controversial relationship with Marxism. Lefebvre, in fact, proposes a sort of return to Marx's letters associated with the idea of the deconstruction of the canonization of Marx's writings in the Marxist tradition. He encouraged an integral reading, is the expression of Lefebvre, of Marx, not as philological exercise, but as political approach to Marx theory, or as he writes in a polemical article entitled Le Paradoxe d'Althusser, published in the review L'Homme et la Société in 1979, as, I quote Lefebvre, a strategical perspective or reading. The idea of integral reading, according to Lefebvre methods, is connected with the idea of the integration of the text with its context, the idea of the interdependence of theory and historical and social context that Lefebvre considers more important than text or theory in itself, because it allows the elaboration of what he calls a living Marxism. This expression, living Marxism, that Lefebvre uses in his big intellectual autobiography, La Somme et le Reste, published in the first time in 1959 and still untranslated, alludes to two important aspects of the heterodox Marxism of Lefebvre. On the one hand, to the bond between theoretical activity and lived experience, and the refuse to conceive theory as a separated and superior domain of human activity, as it happened in modern academic institutions. On the other, living Marxism alludes to the necessity to understand the social dimension of living at the small scale, and to the necessity to elaborate a materialistic analysis of the everyday life. The theoretical and political analysis of the everyday life is one of the most significant objectives of Lefebvre's philosophy, and it constitutes one of the original aspects of his Marxism, making the difference between his work and that of other important French Marxist thinkers of the period, in particular Louis Althusser and Jean-Paul Sartre. Lefebvre indeed considers Althusser an emblem of a deadly and purely theoretical Marxism, and Sartre an example of an a prioristic discredit of everyday life in the conception of an emancipatory project. The imperative slogan, change the life, changer la vie, that Lefebvre shares with Surrealism and Dadaism in his youth, in the progressive consolidation of this thought, becomes an invite to adopt a materialistic and micrological perspective to judge political proposals, even the commonest one, by setting them against their effect on the concrete domain of everyday life. This perspective brings Lefebvre to assume an extremely skeptical position toward the communist experience of Soviet Union, and leads to his eviction from the French Communist Party in 1958. I argue that the issue of the living, in the sense of defining a micro-political perspective of analysis, is the distinctive topic of Lefebvre's heterodox Marxism, and, as I will demonstrate, the starting and equilibrium point of the construction of his research program. In fact, the theoretical core of the research program consolidates when the question of the living intersects the question of space in the context of European Fordist urbanism, or more precisely, when the functionalist organization of the living connected the urban expansion of the post-war period becomes a principal political device to integrate the social reproduction to the production system, becoming, in this way, an instrument of global restructuring of capitalist society. I will proceed to develop this topic. Between 1945 and 1975, during the so-called glorious 30 years of European economic development, the population of a city like Paris grew something about 2 million units. In this context, Lefebvre considers the housing question a fundamental political one. In the new model of housing and in the emerging forms of human agglomeration, he recognized a specific political technology that transformed the complex practices of dwelling, l'habité, in the abstract concept of the habitat. In fact, in the construction of the so-called new city during the 50s and in the proliferation of the Grand Ensemble, a big agglomeration, in the main French metropolis from the mid-50s to the mid-70s, architectural and urbanistic functionalism becomes the hegemonic model to manage the big infrastructural and real estate investments, consumption, transformation, migration phenomenon in the context of decolonization and the very fast urbanization process. At the core of functionalist architectural and urban conception of space, elaborated by Le Corbusier between the 30s and 40s on the 20th century, there is therefore to apply the principle of efficiency of industrial production to the architectural and urbanistic knowledge and practice. According to Lefebvre, the result of the adoption of this principle in the formulation of the most important European urban plans between 50s and 70s, as for example the two main urban plans of Paris in 1958 and 1967, is the extension of the logic of capitalism to the whole society through the production of an abstract social space and an abstract social temporality that Lefebvre called respectively habitat and everydayness. In this framework, the functionalist concept of the machine for living, la machine à habiter, formulated by Le Corbusier, becomes for Lefebvre the emblem of a production process that involves space, time, and everyday life. To underline the theoretical relevance of this topic in the progressive articulation of Lefebvre's research program, can be useful to make reference at the conception of the machinery developed by Marx in the foundation of the Critique of Political Economy, or the so-called Grundrisse of 1857. In a particularly well-known and extraordinary passage of the Grundrisse, Marx explained that, I quote, "In no way does the machine appear as the individual worker means of labor. Because of the contrary, machinery appears as the most adequate form of capital." End quote. And he had, I quote again, "The development of the means of labor into machinery is not an accidental moment of capital, but is rather the historical reshaping of the traditional inherited means of labor into a form adequate to capital." End of quote. In the critique of the machine for living, Lefebvre seems to make implicit reference to those passages of Marx, establishing a kind of imperfect analogy with Marx's argument. For him, in fact, the machine for living becomes the expression of the most adequate form of capital, and then a symptom of an historical reshaping of capitalism. According to Lefebvre, the hyper-industrialization of society through the Fordist urbanization brings capitalism toward a critical point of transformation that he articulates in terms of transition from the industrial age to the urban age. Before to develop this topic, it's important to deepen the Lefebvrean diagnosis of the hyper-industrialization of society. As I argue, functionalism is considered by Lefebvre the emblem of a production process that involves space, time, and everyday life, of the extension of the logic of capitalism to all aspects of life. The result of these expansive dynamics that Lefebvre defines also a colonization of life is the transformation of the everydayness into an abstract and standardized social form of living. Lefebvre indeed distinguishes the everyday, that he calls le quotidien, from the everydayness that he calls la quotidianité, meaning with the first, with the everyday, and revealing a strong influence of Nietzsche vitalism, a sort of ontological source of possibility and continuous transformation of the reality. And with the second, with the everydayness, a form of capitalistic subsumption of life. This conception of everydayness as capitalistic subsumption of life establishes a significant difference from the phenomenological concept of life world and from ontological concept of everydayness, the Alltäglichkeit by Heidegger. According to Lefebvre, indeed, everydayness doesn't describe the frame of individual experience, but the structure of the systemic social reproduction in capitalist society that results from a specific process of abstraction. In order to explain this point, Lefebvre uses the category of concrete abstraction, formulated by Hegel and originally employed by Marx to elaborate the theory of abstract labor. Indeed, when in La reproduction de rapport de production of the 1971, Lefebvre claims that in the everyday, I quote, "in the everydayness, concrete becomes abstract, in the abstraction becomes concrete," he alludes to what Marx writes about labor in the so-called Introduction of 1857. Namely, that the labor becomes an abstract experience in consequence of the formation of specific historical conditions of production. Adopting this theoretical perspective, Lefebvre considers the everydayness as the historical result of the rationalization of the sphere of social production in capitalist society. He claims the point very clearly in a passage of his book De la vie quotidienne dans le monde moderne, published in France in 1968, when he states that, I quote Lefebvre, "Obviously men always had to need to nourish, to clothe, to duel, to making object, to reproduce what consumption destroys. But despite this, until the 19th century, until the competitive capitalism and world of commodities were not affirmed. The realm of everydayness did not exist. According to Lefebvre, therefore, everydayness is a product of a capitalist society, and more precisely, is considered with the extension of the industrial logic to the sphere of social reproduction obtained through the production of the functionalist habitat. The abstraction of everydayness, in fact, results from the repetitiveness of gestures and activities, the same repetitiveness of production line. Go to work, go back home, do shopping at the shopping center, go to the park, to bring children at school, to meet friends on weekend, and so on and so forth. All the rhythms of life are adapted to the rhythm of the production system. In fact, as Lefebvre argues in the text Right Analysis Project, written with Catherine Regulier and published in English in the review Rethinking Marxism in 1999, everyday life is shaped by an abstract and quantitative time that subordinates every day at the organization of labor and space. Further exploring the same argument in the book Elements de Rythme Analyse of 1992, Lefebvre observes that the everyday takes shape, creating a repetitive organization. This latter is made possible by space, production, and organization. The analysis of everyday allows Lefebvre to elaborate a complex diagnosis of society, shifting its interest from the factory to the city, and in that way laying the foundation for the critique of political economy of space and time. In particular, I argue, the close examination of the relationship between functionalist production of space and the production of everydayness can be considered the theoretical laboratory of the Lefebvrean research program. This latter indeed takes shape from the generalization of the theoretical hypothesis of social production of space and of its centrality in the process of structuring of capitalist society. In the fourth volume of his monumental work, De l'État, a work in 4 volumes published in France between 1976 and 1978, and translated partially in the volume Space, State, War, recently edited by Brenner and Helden, Neil Brenner and Stuart Helden. Lefebvre observes that, I quote, space is strangely extraneous in the usual political reflection, and for that, political thought and the representation that he elaborates stay suspended in the air. This image of a thought suspended in the air recalls the famous Marxian critique of philosophy and the consequent effort to bring philosophy on the feet. Lefebvre seems to follow the same goal by elaborating a kind of spatialized political thought that, according to him, implies, I quote again, a reconsideration of economy in terms of space, flow, stock, mobile and stable elements, in brief, a reconsideration of economy as a production and reproduction of social space. End of quote. This formulation of the research program is quite impressive if we consider the recent global economic transformation and the emergence, for example, of the globalized logistic enterprise as one of the most significant domains of current economic system. According to Lefebvre's theory, to reconsider economy in terms of production and reproduction of social space implies the analysis of 3 different, simultaneous and related processes of production of space. Lefebvre, indeed, combining different theoretical sources, distinguishes between what he calls space practices, generating the physically perceived space, representations of space, generating scientifically no space, and spaces of representation, generating the lived space. With the first one, space practices, Lefebvre points out the production of physical infrastructure of social space, like houses, streets, airports, border, and so on. Within the second, a representation of space, he alludes to scientific conceiving of space and its relation with power. For example, engineering, urban planning, architecture as instruments of space governance. Within the third, space of representation, finally, Lefebvre means the images of space that depend on the lived experience. For example, a border in a complex experience of boarding crossing, or a place linked to a traumatic memory, and so on. For Lefebvre, therefore, production of space implies the interaction, the conflictual interaction between those dynamics. Starting from this theory of space production, Lefebvre analyzes rural, industrial, and urban social spatial assemblage and their relationship with the creation of the expansion and the expansion of capitalism. According to Lefebvre, in fact, defining space as a social product also implies the recognition of its historicity. The history of space, however, must be conceived not as a linear evolution, but as it is as a morphological stratification in which the past, the present, and the future coexist in a complex relationship and in continuous reciprocal transformation. For Lefebvre, indeed, spatiality is the domain of the simultaneity, of the consistence of elements. The rural and the industrial survive in the urban, but they are radically transformed. In his most famous books, Le droit à la ville, The Right to the City, published in France in 1968, and La Révolution urbaine, published in France in 1970, Lefebvre describes the spatial ages of the rural, the industrial, and the urban as fields or continents, each one characterized by its own waves of thinking, acting, and living. As I argued before, for example, the industrial is qualified by an abstract concept of space and from the consequential standardization of all life domains. On the contrary, the rural is characterized by a qualitative relationship with space, and so by a magical religious representation of reality. In this framework, Lefebvre considers the transition from the industrial spatial age to the urban spatial age as a critical point that introduces a radical discontinuity in the historical social space. The urban, in fact, is conceived as a phenomenon of explosion and implosion. From one side, the explosion of the urbanization process and its peculiar endless extension of peripheries. From the other side, the consolidation of new centers of hyper-agglomeration. This urban revolution, as Lefebvre calls it, does not point out a simple morphological transformation, but a radical and structural societal reconfiguration. According to Lefebvre, the critical point is the overturning of the nexus between industrialization and urbanization. In a way, the industrialization becomes secondary in relation to the urbanization process. This interaction between industrialization and urbanization is described in the theoretical framework of the progressive-regressive method that Lefebvre elaborates, developing the Marxian idea, according to which the analysis of capitalism as the most evolved social configuration explains also the previous one. Lefebvrean conception of the urban, indeed, recalls what Marx writes in so-called Introduction of 1857, namely that, I quote Marx, "In all forms of society, there is a specific kind of production which predominates over the rest. Was relation thus assigned rank and influence to the other. It is a general illumination which bathes all of bits all the other colors and modify their particularity. It is a particular ether which determines the specific gravity of every being which has materialized within. End of quote. Lefebvrean concept of the urban is comparable to the particular ether of which Marx talks, to a specific kind of production which predominates over the rest. Lefebvre, in fact, considers the urbanization process as a complex and qualitative transformation of society. For that reason, in his opinion, it also constitutes a virtual possibility to create new form of lives, a new kind of political organization. The formula urban revolution indeed indicates both an analytical and political perspective. Strongly influenced by the French social movement of 1968 and more generally by the social struggles around the world during the 60s and 70s, Lefebvre notices the emergence of a new political subjectivity, very different from the traditional white male working class of the orthodox Marxist tradition, that includes, for example, students, migrants, women. Then a new political subjectivity that affirms a multiplicity of needs and desires. In this context, he reclaims the right to the city, not as a nostalgic idea of going back to the traditional European city, but as a right to urban life, transformed and renewed. For Lefebvre, this latter, the right to the city, implies a political struggle to determine what a urban society must be. As suggested by David Harvey, indeed, the right to the city is a kind of empty signifier that need to be performed by a social subject and with some concrete political project. Starting from the political engagement of Lefebvre's research program, I want to sketch some conclusions and some points for the discussion. The urban age, in fact, is today fully realized. What Perec wrote in the 70s, with his imaginative style, namely that, I quote Perec, "The city is our space, we don't have another," perfectly describes the current situation. In this context, the urban question becomes one of the most relevant political questions of the present, for many reasons. Firstly, the urbanization induces to the formation of new paradigms of capitalist accumulation, exploitation, and violent social differentiation. Second, the megalopolis of the present become the laboratories for the construction of different governmental devices and the places of articulation between economical and political power at the global scale. At the same time, cities form the context of emergence for new social movements, of contestation of social injustices and inequalities, and of political engagement from below. The planetary urbanization, then, is a very conflictual process which calls for the theoretical effort to proceed at high level of complexity. In this framework, I want to focus our attention onto the deep interaction between the urbanization and the development of the so-called platform capitalism. In the context of the variegated urban neoliberalism, indeed, we attend to increasingly widespread application of digital technology onto urban life that produces a double result. On the one side, the formation of a sort of algorithmic governance based on the collection of the big data through the interaction between political power and the digital industrial oligopoly. On the other side, the stabilization of a form of biocapitalism. I mean an economic system in which everyday life and its relational, communicative and affective wealth, as well as social creativity and cooperation, become a field of a direct extraction of value. In this scenario, the ambitious research program of Lefebvre can be very useful, since it provides us with the theoretical tools to analyze the interaction between different scales of social organization, and in particular, to highlight the relation of the global scale of capitalist accumulation and the micro level of lived experience. The analysis of the production of space, in fact, offers us a strategy to target the interaction between urbanization process, capitalist valorization, technological development, and subsumption of everyday life. The perspective of this interaction can be a starting point for a critical and political approach to the so-called smart city or smartification process. And I want to suggest, coming at the end of my speech, also the starting point of a possible definition of a right to the urban life. Thank you for the attention.